material concerning the future of social control and surveillance. It really lays out two competing visions for how individual liberty is being eroded. On one side, you have this very visible, policy-driven, structural consolidation of power, something documented explicitly in institutional blueprints like Project 2025. And then on the other side, you face this theoretical, but I have to say alarmingly plausible, threat of high feasibility, covert technological capabilities that leverage, biochemical and even neurobiological substrates.
Right.
So the central question we have to tackle today is really this. Does the most urgent threat to civic liberty come from that centralized, policy-driven structural control, or from these emerging, untraceable, and frankly, biologically focused technologies like microplastic biomarkers and portable neural decoding? I'm going to argue that the greatest danger is the structural and systemic mechanism, the conscious, visible centralization of political power.
And I'm going to maintain that those structural threats you're describing, well, they only create the perfect dark cover for what I see as the most insidious danger, the high feasibility, covert exploitation of our own biochemical substrate for tracking and control. We are, I think, witnessing the creation of an ambient sensor network that turns the human body into an unwitting transponder.
Okay, so for me, the primacy of the threat has to rest with the conscious centralization of political power. When we look at something like Project 2025, we are not discussing speculation. This is a detailed, documented blueprint for what you could call institutional conquest. I mean, the plan explicitly outlines the policy goal to dismantle the administrative state. It talks about replacing thousands of career civil servants with political loyalists and putting the bureaucracy in trauma. The goal is just crystal clear. Ensure the entire mechanism of government aligns solely with one person's agenda. The danger here is systemic rigidity, what the cyberneticist Stafford Beer called variety attenuation.
Variety attenuation.
Exactly.
Simply put, the complexity of reality, the variety, is intentionally squeezed out. Government models are designed with such low variety through, crude aggregation of complex data or just time lags in information flow that they're basically designed to no longer quite fit reality. The system becomes intentionally rigid, simplified. It ensures it can only process the one desired political narrative while ignoring everything else. This structural approach isn't surveillance through some new tech. It's surveillance through enforced political conformity. And to understand the scope of this, just look at historical precedent. We have decades of evidence of how regulatory capture allows known harms to persist. The case studies around tetraethyl lead or TEL or industrial fluoride contamination, they're very illustrative.
Right, the manufactured doubt. Yes, exactly. TEL's toxic effects were known for decades, but industry manufactured scientific doubt, leveraging influence within government to delay enforcement. And it was used until the 1990s. This shows that the biggest threat is often not a futuristic weapon, but just a successful long-term institutional capture where harmful systems persist for decades.
That's a powerful argument for the immediate threat of bureaucratic failure. And I see why you think that, but I would argue that this structural decay, the intentional trauma to the bureaucracy you describe, well, it provides the perfect operational environment for the exploitation I'm concerned with. My position is that the greatest threat is the creation of a covert ambient sensor network, and the core fear isn't necessarily a massive government rollout from the start, but what the material calls the discovered utility framework. Basically, the opportunistic realization that existing environmental contamination can be repurposed for tracking. We know microplastics are ubiquitous. The evidence shows they do accumulate in human tissue. Our bodies are becoming reservoirs for this stuff. So if trace amounts of engineered fluorophores, things like rhodamine-doped particles, are covertly introduced into the supply chain, these microplastics suddenly become detectable biomarkers. You can identify them at the single particle level with portable imaging systems. So all of a sudden, the idea that microplastics could be used for tracking, it just jumps from being almost zero to a very high probability simply by realizing what we've already ingested can be read like a transponder.
And let's talk about the tech constraints on surveillance. High-fidelity thought reconstruction, the kind of mind reading we see in sci-fi, that does require huge breakthroughs. But covert surveillance, it bypasses this by using biochemical signal enhancement.
We have research showing that nanoparticle neural tracers, specifically engineered espions, can achieve significant brain uptake. This is a practical, near-term pathway for targeted surveillance. We're already seeing preliminary studies that can construct a rough image of what a person is focused on using live brain flow data fed to an AI. And if that kind of data acquisition system were ever to become mobile, integrated into police vests or even advanced eyewear, having a pre-administered biochemical enhancer just makes the task orders of magnitudes easier.
I see the pathway, but the precedent seems...
Oh, the operational precedent for this level of covert administration is strong. You just have to look at incidents like Project MKUltra or the Paul Benowitz case, where genuine technical capability was successfully mixed with manufactured evidence over multi-year operations. It just demonstrates that deep cover deployment of tracking agents without consent has been part of the state playbook for decades. This is about current feasibility, not some future fantasy.
I have to hold the line against that technical leap, though. You are asking us to fear mobile brain scanners, microplastic transponders, biochemical enhancements. I agree that targeted operations on a few high-value individuals are feasible, but let's zero in on your use of the word mass. The source material states unequivocally that meaningful, portable thought decoding that poses a mass threat is limited to 2040 or beyond. And it's because of the fundamental calibration bottleneck. This isn't just a hardware problem. You need prior subject enrollment, massive computing power. It really limits the exotic threat to specialized use. Meanwhile, Project 2025 mandates a far simpler, verifiable, and immediate expansion of surveillance. It calls for total information sharing for immigration and a centralized surveillance apparatus for reproductive health. It leverages existing data, hospital records. Biggest, most immediate information threat is centralizing data that already exists, not waiting for neurotech. It's far more efficient to just use the snitch pucks already on every corner, the ubiquitous cameras and microphones in public facilities, and merge that data via policy than to contaminate the entire populace.
That is a powerful technical constraint, I agree, but I think it misses the near-term operational risk. Aren't you making the mistake of equating high-fidelity thought decoding with simple presence confirmation? That 2040-plus timeline applies the, reconstructing a visual scene from someone's mind, the immediate, high-feasibility danger, and the estimated 60 to 75% feasibility right now is targeted contamination simply to confirm presence at a specific location.
So not reading thoughts, just tracking bodies.
Exactly. We are talking about covert administration of a tracking marker via food or a beverage, which is detectable within the 12 to 72-hour GI transit window using low-cost field equipment. A $3,000 portable spectroscopy is all you need in the field. This allows for real-time tracking of specific groups, maybe an entire town, far more feasibly than deploying, advanced MRI machines everywhere. And I'd also contend that the two threats are not separate. They're operating with aligned incentives. Your structural policy cuts become the very mechanism to exploit my technological substrate. The microplastic research shows a really strong statistical link, a high correlation between policy impacts, specifically SNAP and Medicaid loss, and a high microplastic exposure risk in specific geographic clusters, like the Alabama Black Belt.
Walk me through that alignment. How does policy deprivation actively generate a surveillable substrate?
Because structural policy directly impacts food access, if the current political administration deems certain areas food barren or restricts what foods can be bought with SNAP benefits, marginalized populations are, paradoxically pushed toward cheaper, heavily processed packaged foods. Those foods carry a demonstrably higher microplastic load from their packaging. So the policy itself, through this engineered socioeconomic deprivation, systematically increases the internal contamination of the most vulnerable populations. It turns those groups into the perfect target cohort for biomarker surveillance. The structural inequality is being exploited to generate a useful surveillable information gradient.
That's a very compelling argument, and the correlation between policy cuts and increased bioexposure is deeply concerning. However, the threat of structural control extends beyond simple tracking and deprivation to the engineering of collective psychological dissolution, which I think in the long term is the more devastating blow to liberty. The immediate harm of the Project 2025 agenda is cognitive. It's aimed at creating what you might call mass unreality, or a shared delusion, a folia da. Bernays' work showed that a sophisticated cybernetician, or in our modern context, an AI guiding a monolithic political agenda, can manipulate hidden unconscious desires to craft engineered narratives and a linguistic fog. The structural aim of traumatizing the bureaucracy is to enforce this conformity. So the immediate threat isn't just being tracked, it's experiencing cognitive and psychological dissolution enforced by this state-sponsored shared delusion.
I understand the danger of what you call a totalitarian psychosis, but I wonder if we are debating the wrong primary mechanism of harm. The covert technological threat isn't merely psychological. It is fundamentally about physical right on top of structural policy. Look at the findings from the reactance-enhanced model in the material. It shows that when contrarian figures amplify warnings about food safety, the subsequent tribal sorting can lead certain groups, often those already targeted by political deprivation, to increase their consumption of processed foods as an act of defiance. And in doing so, they increase their internal contamination and their utility as a biological transponder.
So they self-administer the marker?
They self-administer. The structural policies you describe, cutting safety nets, they're just the accelerant. The technology turns deprivation into a vulnerability. And if we look at the future of police deployment, the vests, the sunglasses that combine AI, thermal, night vision, these devices become exponentially more effective if the targets are already pre-tagged. They wouldn't need massive tracking infrastructure. They just fly an autonomous drone or aim a vest-mounted sensor to confirm presence because the marginalized populace has been systematically forced to ingest the required biomarker. The structural attack on policy ensures the technological attack on the body is successful.
That's a strong connection. It shows the threats are, in a way, symbiotic. But have you considered that the policy of traumatizing the bureaucracy and creating centralized power is the necessary prerequisite for deploying any unified system-wide tracking, covert or otherwise, without it immediately failing internally? Stafford Beer's model is clear. Institutional failure comes from complexity and variety. The structural reforms in Project 2025 ensure the government operates as a monolithic, low-variety agent, ready to implement covert strategies across multiple agencies without the typical democratic friction. You need that collapse of bureaucratic complexity first to allow the systemic deployment of markers, whether they're rhodamine-doped microplastics or advanced SPI-ONWIS, without a fragmented bureaucracy generating whistleblowers or internal resistance. The structural reform creates the agent of control. The technology merely provides the payload.
Okay, so I think we have established that the threat of covert, high-feasibility technological exploitation is immediate and grounded in very strong operational precedents. From the discovered utility of microplastics as unavoidable biomarkers to the use of nanoparticles for enhanced neural tracing, the capability for targeted contamination and tracking exists right now. This is not speculative. It is actively being layered onto existing socioeconomic fault lines where policy-driven deprivation increases the exposure risk. So while high-fidelity thought decoding may be years away, the human body is already becoming an ambient sensor network. And for me, that means resources must be focused on immediate defensive countermeasures, things like independent biological monitoring and, aggressive auditing of research grants that could lead to this kind of dual-use exploitation.
I'm still not convinced that the technological threats, while concerning, supersede the immediate crisis of democratic collapse. They still seem reliant on targeted applications or a high degree of technical administration. The immediate, verifiable crisis is the systematic degradation of our democratic institutions through documented policy blueprints. This institutional dismantling, aimed at creating a centralized, low-variety system and stripping civil servants of their autonomy, is the necessary infrastructure to deploy any surveillance technology, simple or complex. So for me, addressing the systemic variety attenuation and the policy mandates, the erosion of a shared reality and the consolidation of power, that is the most effective path to preventing totalitarian control. Whether the primary danger is the collapse of structural sanity or the rise of biological opacity, the material suggests that complexity, communication, and trust are all decaying simultaneously, forcing the public, I guess, to form their own conclusions about which front line demands the most urgent defense.